So welcome to this, the second of what we're calling the New Monasticism Sessions. And it's great to have leaders of new monastic communities from around the world and the United Kingdom. And it's very good to have people with us today. And we have Ned, Rachel, Simon, Penny, Pete, and not Simon, and Mark joining us today. The furthest being of our little group is Rachael down in Australia, so it's great to have her with us today. And today we're following on from what we discussed last time, which was thinking about what we're learning around the pandemic and then speaking into the new monasticism network. The question today is very much thinking about what we're learning, being involved in the mindset and vocation to new monasticism or forms of new monastic communities, and what that says to the church in this pandemic, particularly thinking about our increasingly post-colonialist, post-Christendom context. So Ned, if you want to unmute yourself, can't even speak now, mute yourself. So Ned will speak first. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be with you all. I come from a context of in a city with quite a lot of deprivation, and most of the parish works in care professions, so they've been at work and serving in that way. And so my first reflection is really about privilege and the blessing and the guilt that has been felt by me in that position of a large vicarage, secure income, all of those sorts of things, which makes me separate from my context in that respect. And grappling with that privilege has been something that has sparked a challenge to what I have always felt a prophetic ministry. And become very aware that I have fallen for the trap of sometimes being a confident prophet, the worst of all the Christian disciples, I think, the person who demands to be a prophet. And again and again, the Lord has reminded me of the reluctance of prophetic and of the desire of the monastic to be secluded, to be hidden, and also to be, in some ways, silently watching. The sentinel image of Stephen Cottrell's new book has really spoke to me in this context of just watching for the signs of God's kingdom. I also have lost my wife just under 2 years ago, and so I am well acquainted with the landscape of grief, the landscape of wilderness and of barrenness, and prior to her death, also a sense in ministry of being very much a wilderness dweller. That has been something very important to me. And reflecting a little bit on how busy the wilderness has become now. Now that the church has moved quite dramatically into wilderness and exile language, it's full of tourists. And at first I was grateful that there were suddenly people here who were experiencing what I've experienced for many, many years, decades in fact, and welcomed them with open arms, and then realized that the lone voice of the wilderness has become a clamoring of competing voices. And so I've been reflecting a little bit on that and about my response to that as people come, and it sort of felt like an invasion of my home, as lots of people have been trying on this wilderness language and this dispersed language and this sense of isolation language. And I've, instead of competing and deciding to shout louder and try and teach and all that sort of stuff, again and again, the passage from Thomas Merton, which I'll read now, has come to mind. The monk is not defined by his task or his usefulness. In a certain sense, he is supposed to be useless, because his mission is not to do this or that job, but to be a man of God, or woman of God, of course. So the monastic call of being just faithful to God, and to be faithful particularly in wilderness, to be watchmen for God's kingdom, to be sentinels, is a patient task, does not go well with knee-jerk responses and and decisions. The Ignatian spirituality says we should not be making decisions in times of desolation. So I've sort of been wanting to say to the wider church, now is not the time to have the conversations about dramatic change, that to dwell in the wilderness is a time of learning, it's a time of waiting and watching and listening, of growing in our understanding of obedience, which is more about the listening of a master, a tender listening in relationship. And sure, there will be times when we leave the desert and the wilderness and return to some kind of promised land which the Lord will lead us to. But for now, to dwell in the wilderness, we need to be quiet and to be hidden. That's what the Desert Fathers have taught me, is that the desert is a time to fight the inner demons, and boy, do I have a lot of them. And so this time has been a chance to fight against that desire to be seen, to be heard, my usefulness, my impact on the world, that missional priority of being out and making change and doing this and doing that. Why do I do that? Why do I always need to compete and be the person that God speaks through? Why do I always need to be the one that does the thing of God? Why do I need to be the hands and feet of God? He doesn't need me. He can do it himself. And I get the privilege of watching him, do amazing things. And so as I've had the privilege of quietly, people who ask to help them navigate the landscape of grief, of despair, and working out how to make a home here, how to not only survive, but also rejoice and be hopeful, and how to find those sources of nourishment in the wilderness. Again and again, it's this hiddenness, this question of who am I to speak? The reluctance of the prophetic. Please don't make me be the one that has to say this. And with all the clamour of voices of the arguments and the disagreements that have emerged because our inner demons are fighting to be heard, again and again the Lord has asked me, the monk is to be secluded, to be useless. And so I want to say that to the church. I want to say, if you want to dwell in the wilderness, remember that the people of God spent 40 years in the wilderness, not 40 days, 40 years. That's a long time. So let's wait, watch, and more importantly, shut up.
Thanks, Ned. Important open words. So yeah, we quickly move on from Sheffield down to Australia, and Rachael will be sharing some words from there. Rachael.
Thank you. So I'm probably not the only one here who had 2020 vision, or for the young people out there, hashtag 2020 vision. This was going to be the year that I would get my driving license, go to a major conference in America and start a magazine. And it's been quite different. We had the bushfires here in Australia, and also obviously coronavirus. So it's been more like my husband and I tag teaming, working and looking after our toddler who's out of childcare. But early on it was very stressful, and I was considering putting everything on hold, like most of the people in the business course I was doing. But Jonathan, my husband, ended up reading a blog post from Tim Challies titled Advice from Italian Christians in Lockdown. And the first piece of advice was about having a rhythm. And we were both like, we can do this. That was life in the community of St Anselm. So having a rhythm, even having boundaries, when we can leave the palace, who we can spend time with outside the community. So since then, we've been trying to keep a rhythm, and for the most part, it's been working. And I'm also reminded of Archbishop Justin Welby's first talk to us as the community. He wanted to impart in us stability, and he said, I've got the quote here, "Stability is about being stable in Jesus, the sense of whatever happens around you, you don't rock around, you're not knocked off your feet." So that's been continually encouraging. And I guess, yeah, what we experience with in the community has definitely stayed and continued with us. In terms of what new monasticism can say to those in the wider Christian church, I've been thinking mainly about the difference between consumer and missional forms of church. You might have been one of the 2.7 million people who viewed the UK Blessing on YouTube. I saw an interview with worship leader Tim Hughes with Sam Hales from Premier Christianity. And Tim said that the role of a worship leader and the role of any senior church partner is not to provide a moment of connection or entertainment on a Sunday. The role is to equip people so they can worship, so they can read their Bibles, so they can pray, have a passion for that. I think that's what God is doing. He's shifting things into people taking responsibility for their faith. We can't be consumers here, much less emphasis on the great preacher, the great worship leader, the great church, actually much more on households and the individuals. But then on the flip side, there's a guy here in Australia called Michael Frost. You might have heard of him. So he's an Australian Baptist, describes himself as an author, speaker, and missiologist and agitator. So he's warned that this pandemic will set the church back 25 years. So all the positive shifts from consumer church to missional church are now reversed because church has gone online. So even the reports of church growth online haven't encouraged him. He sort of describes it as Uber Eats for churches. And I've got a quote here from him. He says, "If you're winning people to a 10 or 15-minute viewing of a pre-packaged worship and teaching experience, devoid of community, mission, correction, reconciliation, or justice, you're not growing the church, you're fostering religious consumers." So who is right? Is this a great opportunity for the church to move away from being consumers, or is this going to set the church back towards consumerism? But I've been seeing friends who have disengaged from church watching online. For them, it's been a safe way to check it out. But then I've also seen church online turned into just another option to consume. Why attend your small town church on Facebook Live when you can go to church with your favorite worship band or preacher? The pandemic has not only challenged, I think, our church's ecclesiology, but it's revealed the hidden ecclesiology of many of our parishioners. I think it's really important for the voices of new monasticism first to try to really understand this complexity before speaking into it. It's not a one way or the other. There's a lot of positives and negatives going on. And some people see new monasticism or new monasticism as a critique of mainstream church. But at Canterbury Cathedral, the Community of St Anselm, we had a lecture from Canon Christopher Irvine, who was very interested in monastic theology. And I love how he spoke about monasticism being the cartoon as to the lead story in the newspaper. Certain things are exaggerated. Monasticism exaggerates the Christian story. So I think for me, the question behind this question, it's a very complex question, is what elements do we new monastics need to exaggerate in this pandemic, and what are the best methods to do so?
Great. Thanks, Rachel. Wow, lots to think about, both from what Ned and Rachel said so far. So we're going to hold on to all of that and those important quotes. And so we're now going to move swiftly from Australia back to London, and Simon is going to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Great to be with you, and really good to hear Ned and Rachel. Yeah, what a strange time we live in at this moment. What I think's been most interesting for us is, for many years, I'm not sure how I would have described our community as that monastic on many levels, but actually the biggest theme that we've seen is that is what has come through in this time, is we found something more of that possibility that was rooted here for us. In what we've been forced into, I've been amazed at the ability of our young people, and we're a collective community of young people in their 20s and 30s, to adapt so well to the change in this time. to be willing to take more responsibility and find more equality in the community life that they share together. It's been a gift for us to see and try things we would never have considered, because, as we all know, our treasured programs become so kind of central to what we do, and we must stick to the rhythms that we've said. And actually, we realize in this special time that we find new rhythms. And I think the abiding theme that has come through for that is a sense of a simpler life. As I said, a life that feels more monastic in its daily rhythms. We have been gifted with a sense of the spaces we have here, and that we can do that, that we are quite able to eventually secure the spaces and find something here at the heart of this palace to be able to return to those rhythms. And what's been interesting about the simplicity of having a rhythm that was daily that stays the same is how that allows us to reimagine the possibility of what our community life can be in the future, which has been a striking thing. And it's very difficult to talk of blessings in a time when so many are struggling so much. But I think it's good to see them and to see what God is doing. Two things to mention specifically, maybe. One is in the craziness of this world, we've been able to start the Ignatian 30-day silent retreat here at Lambeth Palace. Who could imagine in the heart of London to do such a thing, to find such silence? The noise is the birds and not much else to disturb it in that way. And yeah, that's shocked me that that's been possible. Also, another gift in another space, virtually online, to see the possibility to see that you can do Ignatian exercises through Zoom and through phone calls in ways that we would never have tried before, because face-to-face seems so crucial and important. And to see that something really is possible to create places, even people with very busy working lives at this time, to take more time to find God in new ways in that sense. So lots of encouragement found in those sorts of spaces. And I think talking back then to some of these challenges for and thoughts for the wider church of what that might mean. I think what's been interesting in my conversations with people who live in very different contexts, with people who are ministering in parishes and are facing much more radical challenges to the way that they operate, is firstly to pick up some of the themes that Rachael touched on, which is about this kind of sense of the consumer church models and the online things. Maybe the first thing to say is I think there's some encouragement for the Fresh Expressions and mission-shaped model, because so much of what's happening now proves so much of what people were talking about before. Maybe we would have been better prepared if people had listened better to the prophets that Ned has spoken of in those ways. But equally, I wonder then also the danger that we find in some of those things, because actually interesting talking to people who planted churches and being part of recent church plants as the church has sought to adapt, a little bit of regret that they are realizing the disconnection of those movements from some of their communities as well. So even communities just sort of 2 or 3 miles down the road where they joined a plant, but big encouragement. Now that they're stuck in their house thinking, well, wouldn't it have been just a bit better if it was a bit more local in those senses? So I've got more hope for the localization of the church again, not maybe on a parish model, but on something that's reimagined in those sorts of ways. And that actually does make us less about buildings, but more about new spaces. And what's interesting for me is I think the virtual spaces will be really important in those sorts of shapes for the future, but I can see already the limitations of them, the fatigue. What I see with our own community where so much went online is that we saw in the beginning that it was so positive, so wonderful to have that connection together. And we see there's like a well that we built up having been together that's been drained. And we can see that we're starting to, even after sort of 2 months, see the limits of that well, and that the need to reconnect, that physicality of connection, which is so crucial to our humanness and to actually what's the center of what it means to share in being the body of Christ, being together, this incarnation, I suppose, that we remember, that we're so remembrance of in this time of Christ's ascension that we celebrated last night. The final word is about privilege. What I'm most concerned about is that the church in other parts of the world is not having the same experience of us. And so it really worries me in those sorts of senses.
Thank you, Simon. So lots to hold on to there. So these themes, as I said, we're going to come back to when we're going to have open conversation at the end. So we're now going to move swiftly from Simon being in London down to Penny in North Devon. Penny.
Thank you very much. It's great to be able to share with you all today. From a new monastic perspective, I want to start with the end of the question. As monastics of whatever variety, our call is a single-minded commitment to God, the monos. And we've each responded to the call to dedicate our lives to God because we could not or would not resist that call. The responsible for me and for so many others now is to give every part of my life with living by a way of life with a rhythm of prayer. The way of life does not alter as a principle in illness, in health, in busy times, in quiet, in joy or in sadness. In any external change, a rhythm continues. Change is inevitable, and I wonder sometimes if we hanker for a myth that might go away if we lived our lives correctly. As I see it, and what I love so much, is that whatever happens, I know this call will not go away, and I respond to God by living a way of life until my last breath, however I may be able to. So you asked for us to reimagine. My inadequate imagination perhaps reveals a deeper longing, maybe a spirit longing. So maybe there is an element of prophetic imagining. Firstly, I wonder if it's time to stop worrying about the church and hear the cry of the world, to look out and see the world that Jesus asks us to go to. There's been real palpable fear because of a new recognition of our mortality. What a gift that is, as unwelcome as it may be. There's nothing like facing our death to discover what is really important. The peoples of our towns and villages have discovered community. In our village here, we've begun to learn not to be afraid to ask for assistance. That is new, and it's very good. Independence and the isolation that comes with that is maybe not so good after all. Community is good. As monastics, we bless the community where we live as a result of our prayer, because as we pray, we come intentionally close to God to achieve nothing except being in that presence of love. In achieving nothing but being there, we go out to our neighbour more practiced with loving without needing. Institution does tend to weigh us down. We lose our lightness of step and our flexibility, but we've seen great flexibility and ingenuity within the local church. Let institution be a resource and not a controller. As new monastics, we also need to be very aware of becoming clunky institutions. I imagine sharing our insights with the church, not in urgent reports, because we've somehow got all the answers as new monastics, but simply in getting on with living our call with ever more commitment, as Ned highlighted. Busyness will never be the salvation of the world, but having time to truly bless our neighbour will. And didn't we see that so beautifully shown this morning in the reading of Jesus with the widow at Cain? So secondly, I imagine the church learning to love the earth that is created and held in love moment by moment. Will we continue to be a part of its destruction with our busyness, our need to travel and consume, to eat too much, to drink too much, to buy too much? Or will we learn to live by simplicity and poverty? Not just for a self-indulgent happiness of seeing birds, hearing birds and seeing stars, but for healing of those who suffer from foul air and climate change because of our greed. Let us cry out in sorrow for what we've been a part of. Let us learn what it means to lament and to get on with lamenting together. But also let us show ways of cherishing the earth and working for justice. Thirdly, many have discovered the sacredness of their own place as they've worshipped at home, like Benedict reminding us that the pots and pans are as sacred as the altar vessels. This is new to many of our congregations, and I believe it's a beautiful discovery, while perhaps it's normal to us as new monastics where we try to find every part of life as sacred. So what would I say to this church post everything and in the continuation of change? Come close to God every day, several times a day, and waste time doing this. Let the Spirit move in lightness so that we might have time for compassion for those who are oppressed and full of fear and who are loved more than we can ever imagine. Thank you.
Thanks, Penny. So much to think through from what you're saying there and holding on to everything so far. This is a rich conversation, so thank you. So we now move from North Devon to Chatham, and Pete is going to speak to us now.
Thanks, Ian. I want to start by saying that we don't necessarily have any unique insight within monasticism. What we do have, however, are experiences that make us more likely to have certain reflections or insights. As with any idea or movement, we have our own strengths and weaknesses, our own clarity and blind spots. My, aren't so many Christian leaders busy at the moment? The race to get online, to continue to be relevant, to not lose our voice in the hubbub of online community during this pandemic. Some of this is glorious, with overbooked online alpha courses, as has already been mentioned, approaching 3 million views of the UK blessing as 65 churches came together to sing a blessing over our nation. And within 24/7 prayer, who I work for, we're also seeing possibly more prayer than ever before. At the same time, however, we have many already overburdened church leaders feeling even more pressure than usual to set up online services, online prayer, online courses. And all of this pressure leads to excess as well. I heard of one church leader exhorting anyone who was of a more introverted nature to get over their inhibitions and push themselves to engage more, as extroverts were in crisis and it was essential to help them. I couldn't believe the level of lower EQ that was displayed there. At the other end of the spectrum, we have some in leadership who are struggling with lost hope, directionless as they have communities where they don't have the resources to offer support online, or congregations for whom online community just doesn't work. One of the things that we have to offer the wider church network in this time is stability, an antidote that reduces our exposure to excess. In saying that, I'm aware that I don't think we have that taped, particularly within new monasticism, but we do have it as a part of our underlying monastic ideals. And it's a part of why our rules, promises, or vows are such an important part of who we are. When crisis hits, our patterns as communities and individuals give us muscle memory that makes us more resilient. Far from perfect, but with the tools in our toolbox that have prepared our daily lives for times such as these. So perhaps one of the challenges to the wider church at this moment is to encourage the development of long-term practices and habits rather than focusing on the delivery of knowledge through courses. This time has also reminded me of our focus on spiritual community. One of the great realizations of my own journey over the last couple of years is how much I value the connection with others in the new monastic network, in practices that would at first seem to lend themselves to individual prayer or reflection. My eyes were open to the difference between silence and solitude on a retreat at St Bino's. Both are important, but for me, my practice of silent prayer and Christ-centered contemplation have been greatly strengthened by praying with others in silence in my local Ignatian community. It seems like a strange notion to me that praying in silence with others helps, but help me it does. I also have Rachael Bennett's and the Tree of Life to thank for introducing me to a group examen, which again has deepened my own use of this great tool of prayer and communion with the Trinity, even if I don't speak with anyone else in the group about my conversation with God in that time. In this time, of course, this has been possible online as well. One of the prayers that many in our order have been praying over the last few months through the Lectio 365 app is, as I enter prayer now, I pause to be still, to breathe slowly, to recenter my scattered senses upon the presence of God. As monastics, I believe one of the challenges we can bring to the wider church and the world at large is to focus, to find spaces in which we can break free from the addiction that we have to technology, and to recognize that we do indeed have an addiction. One of the things this pandemic has taught many is that constant news feeds on what is going on with the virus is bad for our mental health. I don't have time to elaborate on this further now, but we need to offer times of focused reflection, freedom within boundaries, and I think us as new monastics have something to add to that conversation. Finally, one of the things that that the Spirit has been drawing me to personally in this pandemic is to reprioritize, to sow into the things that I'm passionate about, to focus more outwardly on the people and networks that I feel a deep affinity with, rather than the easy, comfortable immediacy of those networks closer to me. Even within the life I have shaped in accordance with my vows in the Order of the Mustard Seed, I find that life has been too busy and that I've not had sufficient time to reflect on how this challenge from the Lord will be outworked. What my new monastic values have made me sufficiently aware of, however, is that I need to prioritize this time and that I need it, even if the price is a few days holiday to focus on it.
Thanks, Pete. So we move swiftly from Chatham up to Derby, and Simon, if you'd like to unmute yourself, and Simon, the new community that just started up there, will speak to us. Simon.
Thank you, Ian. I speak to you, yes, from Derby, and I'm in a bit of a strange situation here in Derby, and I'm both the acting area dean of a city of 250,000 people and supporting 35 Anglican church clergy. And yet in my heart, I feel called to new monasticism. I feel called to the place of small community and the intensity of relationship within small community. And I speak from both those experiences over the last few weeks. I hear from Pete the immense pressure on church leaders, the pressure to conform, the pressure to be. The church response has been both varied and in some ways has sent us back to our own personality, to our own gifting, our own theological tradition. People have sought to be the best parish church they can be, to do all the funerals as much as possible. Others have raced to online, and we're streaming as much as we can to spiritual seekers. Others have got engaged in mutual support networks. They've got involved in food distribution and self-help groups. Lockdown has caused innovation, but in other ways, we've all gone back to what we're good at, to what we enjoy. And the bigger picture of the church at large is becoming more like a patchwork quilt of many different initiatives, many different ideas, all trying to stitch them together. So what does new monasticism have to say to all this? Well, for me, new monasticism speaks most importantly of relationship. And in the time of lockdown, a time when people are craving relationship, a time when people are in small dispersed households. Some of those people are living alone. some of those people are living in abusive relationships. The call for quality relationship, the call for a intensity of relationship in a place when relationship is strained. What am I talking about when I talk about relationship? Well, of course, I'm talking about a relationship with God. I'm also talking about a relationship with other people. And primarily also a call to a relationship with the marginalised. My personal walk and my personal call is very inspired by the life of St Aidan. St Aidan spent half his time praying on the island of Lindisfarne. He was focused on his prayer life, his connection with the Lord. But then when the tide was out, he walked out amongst the poor and the marginalised. He connected with those who were on the edge. But then he did not stick back to prayer. He also went to the castle of Bamborough Castle, and he spoke and he challenged the powerful about what was going on. And I think we're called to these three relationships. We're called to relate to God, to spend time carefully listening, prayerfully, spending time in his presence. We're called to relate to our community, to identify what's happening in our community. I feel particularly we are called to the margins. I'm part of the Society of the Holy Trinity, and we feel particularly called to the urban marginalised. We may not be in the desert anymore, but we are in a period of a great increase in marginal issues. The facts that are coming out about the number of mental health illnesses, the significant rises in unemployment. I live in Derby, it's just been affected by an announcement from Rolls-Royce. The increase in debt and in poverty. These voices of the marginalised will only increase, I believe, in the months and years ahead. And so we need to speak to the powerful, we need to speak to those who are challenged positions and responsibility. So how do we speak as new monastics from those three relationships in an authentic way? I was challenged by what Ned said, that he drew an analogy from the exile. I've also often delved into the exile as my place of refuge, and I'm finding it a cluttered place. But in exile, that is where most people feel that synagogue emerged. In synagogue, there was a meeting and a gathering place. And where synagogue emerged was from three main themes. It was from a prayer house, it was from a study hall, and it was from a community centre. The three elements come back out again. A place to pray, a place to gather to pray, a place to have conversation and to reflect on what's happening in the world and to challenge what is going on in the world around us, and a place of community service, a place to serve those who are poor. And I believe we are called as monastics to focus on these three relationships, and they can be offered to the wider church. Thank you.
Thanks. And now we shift from Derby up to Mark, who's up in Telford. And so, Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Ian. Technically, it's a down, but...
Oh, you disappeared there.
That's all right. So yes, and I have a confession to make, first of all, that I'm sitting here suffering from chair envy. So thank you to Ned for giving me that affliction this morning. It's interesting listening to this and reflecting on some of the conversations that have been going on over the last few weeks. And I think there are some things that are becoming very clear to me, and there are lots of things that aren't. And I guess the first thing that's becoming clear to me is that we're not there yet. We don't yet know what the question is that we're being asked. We don't know where we're going to be when we come out of this. We don't know what culture's going to be like. But the other thing that I'm increasingly becoming certain of is that we are not the answer. We are not going to be the solution to the world's problem. We never should have been. We're meant to be that way. And I think that for me is something that is becoming increasingly clear to me personally, and that we actually need to somehow let go of that need to be the world's answer, the community or the group or the institution that is going to solve the problems of the world. But we are in this time of great flux, of great change. We don't yet know where we're going to be. We don't know what's coming of it. And I'm struck by evolutionary biologists talk about this thing, the adaptive zone, that when there is environmental change, there is this period of adaptation, a zone of change and shift and fast growth and fast death and all sorts of things happening and exploring and exploding and dying and so on. And Joseph Schumpeter took that to think about what happens when we have global economic change. And he says that we go through an economic adaptive zone where entrepreneurialism explodes and we see new things emerge and some things flourish and some things die quickly. And that's part of the nature of change. And then Marshall McLuhan took that another stage and said, well, actually, when we look at cultural change, particularly when there's technological change, we see the same things happen as we have different responses. And McLuhan says that there are normally three broad responses to technological change. The first is that we reject it. We become Luddites, if you like, and we reject the change, we reject the technology, and we move away from it. The second is that which is the most common, he says, is that we use the new technology to do the old things. We take that new technological advance and we just use it to do the things that we've always done. But the third thing he says is that actually comes a point where we stop doing either of those and we start to see what the new technology offers us in terms of new ways of being, new ways of thinking, new ways of doing things. And I think that's an interesting place to be. And I'm not sure that we are there yet. If we think culturally, if there is cultural change, how do we not resist it or simply adapt it to do what we've always done, but find out, well, what does it actually offer? What does it mean itself? I was struck on Sunday morning here in the UK. I don't know if it was the same globally, but right at the time that all the churches were doing trying to do their live streaming, Zoom decided to update its servers, and lots of services crashed. And I have to again confess, I smiled. In fact, actually, I'll go further. I laughed, and that's not as a criticism or and I feel bad for those who were really struggling with trying to run services on Zoom on Sunday. But there was an irony to me, as I think there's a dependency that's developed, in terms of we've moved from one structural dependency of buildings to another. But what does the new? There is no going back. So for me, the question is, what do we need to let go of? What do we need to sacrifice, maybe? And something about that is actually our need to be the answer. Something about that is our need to organize. But instead, perhaps we need to listen to the rhythms that are changing and discover rhythms that are not just in sympathy, but actually emerge from those around us, that are local, that are relational, that flow from those relationships. And the second thing is to actually discover the place of intercession, of living intercession, stepping into God's flow of love for people in an inclusive way that invites people into a place of prayer. But the key thing is we're not there yet. So actually, how do we learn and listen and engage and allow the world to shape and change the way that we encounter God with each other?
Great. Thanks, Mark. A lot's there to think about. Wow, follow that then. It's always my privilege to come last in these things. Can you all hear me? The technology's gone a bit, you can see me and hear me. That's good because my technology's gone a bit funny this end. So let me just work out. I'm just going to do something to try and get that sorted out. Hold on a minute. Right. Yeah, apparently I don't exist. So I'll speak anyway. So I'm not sure it's recording me. So I'm going to go to tile mode because then it can see me. There we are. So it seems to be focused on you, Mark. I don't know why. Anyway, so let me just share what I wanted to share very, very quickly. I don't want to take too long, but I want to echo some of the themes. First thing I think I want to say is, what do our times reveal? I think that's always the starting place for anybody who's called to focus on prayer. And I think if you look at church history, I'm thinking of the times of other pandemics, they have led to major cultural change. We remember that the Black Death marked at the end of the feudal system, which was partly economic, in a sense there was less people to oppress to force them to work for a pittance. And then we suddenly have the market, people having to dictate their relationship to that market rather than being oppressed by it. So we see the end of feudalism, and we have seen major other epoch changes. So what is revealed in our own context? Well, I think we've said this in other places, but we see how we are so determined now by being in a capitalist market society, and that when things like pandemics hit, that economics doesn't have much that it can contribute to the immediate. So we see the collapse of many parts of our society, which are too defined by business and commodification. I think what it reveals to our church then, that we've also, the challenge of the church in every age is how do we be in but not of a particular culture? And that is a difficult balance to get. But I think more recently we have colluded too much with church's business. And I think we have been caught short in this. It's very interesting seeing how traditional religious communities in this pandemic are just carrying on as normal, but our dioceses in many ways have collapsed in the way that they are colluding with a particular model. I also think there's something here about the church and about being too activist focused, that our identity is too much focused on doing rather than being. And I echo everything that my brothers and sisters here have already said, that we have, I think, as a church, dumbed down on prayer. We have, I think, a terrible attitude to prayer where we have promoted in the past something that sounds a little bit consumerist, where we send prayers upstairs to God as holy social worker expecting some sort of download. And that's a deeply unhealthy attitude towards prayer as consumptive fulfillment, colluding with a bit of prosperity gospel, rather than reality about prayer, about encountering God. It's fundamentally not about what I gain, but about the experience of encountering God. And I think that's a massive one. And therefore digging deeper with what Penny has said and what Simon Embry has said, and how we dig deeper with prayer as a source of transformation and encounter with God. I think we've relied too heavily either on liturgy or we've relied too much on preaching, and we have really dumbed down on the idea of prayer as a resource for conversion, of hope giving and receiving of the Holy Spirit. So I think this is really good that we have really been forced to face prayer. The other thing about activism, I think, is that the church has, like all civic institutions, been in danger of making itself God. Often the church, when it's done some of the most terriblest things, is when it's assumed the absence of God rather than the presence of God. And what I've been learning from the 12-step movement, that our chief role is about surrender. And I think as new monastics, trying to be that call to contemplative action, where we can't do too much action at the moment other than what's online. There's something about learning from the 12-step movement, which is about getting over ourselves, which is about this idea of surrender, allowing God to lead and not to try and control everything. I think too many churches and too many church leaders are a little bit control freaky, and I include myself in that sense of letting go of the need to be in control and to surrender to what God wants. And it's not easy to work out what God wants sometime, and therefore time not to jump to trying to be the solution to the world. The other thing I think I want to say, that there's a massive opportunity. I think we have to wake up to some of the work that's been done. I think I'm particularly thinking of Andy Freeman's work at the moment, and around the fact that many people now make decisions about what's important through experience. And actually many people are strip mining things that work from all sorts of different traditions to define who they are, particularly around well-being and mental health, which is often where many people start searching for spirituality. So the challenge then, and I don't know the answer to this, is that how do we provide opportunities for people to experience God, but without colluding with consumptive gratification? And that is a big challenge, and I don't know what the answer is there. But the danger is that if we commodify everything as some sort of course or some sort of do this and you'll experience God, then somehow we're losing that. So how do we promote the opportunity, which I think is what monastics and mendicants have done through the centuries, about providing opportunities for people to experience community, experience prayer, experience loving service to the poor? How do we do that in a way that's not commodified? And I am slightly feeling sick with the amount of commodification that's already happened. And I am deeply disturbed by some of the stuff that I'm seeing, which for me is all about trying to grab consumerism rather than letting go of it. So how do we do this well? I think finally, just that there's never been, in the research I've done previously, that there's been kind of 8 to 9 serious epoch crises in the Western Church. And it has always been a form of religious community or some sort of radical community that's helped the church recontextualize from one epoch into another. And that goes right back to the Desert Mothers and Fathers, as people have quoted already. So how do we do that well? And then finally, how do we be part of the future? Well, I think we, in the United Kingdom particularly, we are still, and I think particularly in England, really have a problem with post-colonialism. We still hold on to an imperialistic mindset. And as part of that, the church sometimes holds on to that place of privilege. And we're now going to find ourselves, I think, in the economic brutality of a culture where there is going to be huge amounts, as people have said, suffering, huge amounts of economic problems. So what does it mean to be in a culture now that can't rely on that imperialistic colonialism to get itself through a crisis as we have done up to date? What does it mean to actually have to let go and find a new context? So the church, I think, is going to have to start again. And I'm hoping it's going to be radical communities. Our communities are living out the faith that are part of the future. So that's what I really hope for what's next. Right. We now come to that point to share a conversation. So I'm going to invite all here to unmute yourselves. You don't have to remain muted at this point. So, so what are the themes? What are the things you're hearing that really connect with what you think are important? So I'm going to give everybody an opportunity to respond, and you can start in any order that you want to.
Okay, I'll go. There's a real sense, isn't there, of a stepping back from achieving, and somehow embracing the opposite of that, of just turning up to be with God, not being great prophets, just simply living it. That seems to come across very clearly.
Thanks, Penny.
I'm always struck by the story of Chad. He's the patron saint around where we live, and both in Birmingham and here in Lichfield diocese. But the story of him selling his horse, selling his horses, because apparently the bishop kept giving him horses and telling him to get on the horse and go and preach from the horseback, and he kept giving up the horse and saying, but no, I don't, and selling it and giving the money away. But the key thing was, he said, I wanted to walk the streets, the same paths as the people. And it does feel to me that there is increasingly a sense of what are the horses that we are prepared to give up, and to what are the things that we're prepared to sacrifice and let die, in order that we can actually really discover what presence is again, and not a colonial presence that comes in as the client provider, we're here to solve your problems, but actually simple presence of deep relationship in the local. And I think that there's a new life in relationship in the giving up of some of those structures and some of those tools and attitudes. And but that death process, that giving up, that sacrifice is painful. And we need to mourn that properly and understand it and acknowledge it. But that, for me, seems to be a growing sense and a theme, or a revelation, I guess, an epiphany. I don't know what you call it. But
thanks, Mark.
That speaks into what you were saying, Ian, about the fact that at times of great shifting sands, you identified 8 back in history, it's almost as if we refine back to what is the basics, what are the most important aspects of our call to church, our call to following Christ. what are the essentials elements of what he's calling us to. And that's, I think, partly why religious community comes to the fore in those times, is we call back into the essential nature of our relationship with God, our relationship with one another, and our relationship with those people around us. And I think that sense of reminding ourselves that the extra trappings that come with church sometimes need to be stripped away, and we need to go back to exactly what is it that God has called us to. And we find that, as you say, in different time periods in history. We also, that's why I went back to synagogue, because I think that's what happened to the Jews. I think they had exactly the same stripping away and a commitment to the essentials of what God was calling them to in that particular context.
Other responses?
I don't think any of us are innocent of idolatry, and facing up to the forms of idolatry that ourselves as individuals or our traditions have fallen prey of are really difficult to discern, but it's painful to hear other people point them out to us, and so there's something of a tenderness of, and I was really grateful for Penny pointing out the reading this morning in morning prayer, because I do Lectio Divina in morning prayer, and the phrase that stood out from that passage from Luke was, "A great prophet has arisen amongst us." And all Jesus did was, he didn't say anything, he didn't speak, he just tenderly cared for another and raised a son to life and brought life where there was grief, and entered into that despair. And I think we need to learn the tenderness of the Spirit, to identify our own idols and to get rid of them, to strip off those things that we have clung to, whatever our tradition clings to, and also to speak tenderly to others and to help them, not by pointing out, go, look, you've got an idol, but to kind of go, I know how painful it is to let go of that, so let's do it together. There's something about, innocence of idolatry. We need to claim that, and as Mark said, process that, and the grief of that is really important.
Just a very quick response. I think that's helpful, Ned. I think I'd want to add to that, though, that some of the things that I think that we need to give up are not bad things. Some of them are good things. Some of them are things that we enjoy and find fruitful, but actually the time is right to sacrifice those and to give up.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the real power of an idol is to kind of say, look, I'm really close to God, but it's not helpful because we're worshipping that rather than the created rather than the creator. So yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Simon.
So there's something Mark and what Ned is sharing about grief and loss, and I love the giving up of idols, but it sort of relates me back to the very tangible kind of sense that maybe one of my sadnesses in this time for the church is that something that I thought we would be good at talking about, which is death, we seem to not be very good at talking about in this time. And we've got much better, I think, at proclaiming Christ's light and life in the world, and we talked about some of the consumer models of church and maybe how there's an overfocus, but there's been a bit of an absence of talking about how we manage or think about death well at this time, in that sense. And I suppose I mean it, we talked a bit metaphorically about how we give things up and individually, but actually the very tangible reality of daily seeing death numbers that we've not been used to seeing come to life in that way. And that may, I don't know, that complicates things for us. Maybe.
Just following on from, I guess, what Mark was saying about those three responses to technology: reject, use it to do the old thing, and see what it has to offer us. I think, there has been quite a bit of just using it to do the old thing, like trying to replicate the 1.5 hour service in a digital format. But I've also seen a huge amount of creativity. And I think this is one area that I think new monasticism can offer is, creativity, but also there is this sense of going back to the tangible. And I think that's one thing, being at Lambeth Palace, you know, having prayer books and things like that, and just experiencing, the tangible over the digital. We're quite minimalist in our digital world there. And so in our context, we've tried to give, you know, order devotionals for people, daily devotionals as a book, New Morning Mercies, I think it's called, for those, not only those who don't have technology, but for those who are suffering from, you know, digital fatigue. And I think that with all that we have to offer, there is ways of getting things that are tangible and beautiful in the hands of people, to give them like a specific break from screens. So that's something that we can, I guess, think about in the way that we creatively respond.
One of my reflections on the whole technology thing is, I think we are in the first two stages that Ian talked about. We've not really found the new way of using it well yet. Because one of my experiences with some of these things, you know, you go on a retreat or something, you know, very often the response is, well, you know, you've got to turn it off and shut it away somewhere. And actually, I think it's because we haven't been ruthless enough about what the problem with technology is. Yeah, one of the things I mentioned is how we're addicted to constant messages. One of my sort of pet hates is instant messaging, and how people constantly want your attention, and use it for the wrong types of communication as well. They ask you to do things rather than just ask you a question, which is what instant messaging kind of is good at. It's not good at answering deeper questions. And actually, I don't think we've been ruthless enough about how we use the technology. I think we need to be really good at helping people to turn off notifications and understand how much their attention is being fragmented, and be really ruthless about doing things like, if we're like on the retreat that I was talking about, actually, do you know what? If you can't turn off the notifications, uninstall it for the time that you're on retreat. You can still use the technology, but use it for good things, not use it for the interruptions. And I think we need to get more articulate with that. Just a perspective.
See, the technology thing worries me a lot, in a sense that around here. So, for example, I think my worry is the pandemic kind of has reinforced a more class-driven society. So, I have people here in the super poor part of where I am, where there is one smartphone for 3 kids and 1 parent. So how are you supposed to do home learning in the context of there being 1 mobile phone and no other access to the internet? And I think my greatest concern is the lack of presence. And it touches what you said, Rachel, in Michael Frost's quote. So the one good thing about the parish system is about the presence with people who are marginalized, who don't have technology, who don't have any privilege, who have very, very little. We are present to that. And my greatest concern, which is bound to happen, dioceses are going to really struggle. I know here we have a huge hole in the finance of the diocese where I am, and the church will not look the same. And my one concern is that they will try and combine things so that Christians become even less present or more further away from those who need it most. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing, we have to be aware that a lot of the people who really suffer around here, they use WhatsApp. They don't have access to Zoom. They don't have access to various other things, but WhatsApp is the big thing that they are able to do. And also it excludes the elderly. There are people here who don't have a phone. So they just, they don't. So what happens there? So I think we have to radically rethink well, how do we practice presence with people? And I'm nervous of a church that relies too much on technology because it immediately excludes. And that really matters to me. So, for example, one of the things I really like about Ned and what his response to some of this is that bell is rung in that church. Is that right, Ned? I think that is it. There as a physical presence that something continues. Something is small, but as significant of that is massive. And to know that someone is praying for people and that isn't such a huge area that they can have a relationship with those Christians. The other thing I think I've also woken up in me, the vision was always, as with religious communities, that worship services were the access point to something much deeper. They were never just supposed to be just worship services on their own, but it was a community living out a rhythm of prayer and action. So the window is, as you like in a traditional religious community, was a way that you access it was through the worship. My concern is that too much about churches are around just doing worship services, and too little around being community and the depth of discipleship that we're hungry for. So I'm really hoping that this might be a wake-up call for the church to go deeper. My fear is the church is going to respond by economics and will make decisions just to keep the ship afloat, but then combine parishes to make it more economically sustainable. And I think that would be a disaster, because I think there's some radical rethinking got to happen around what it means to be a Christian presence in every place. I'll shut up ranting now. So, other thoughts? Yeah, a bit of time.
I think sorry, I don't know, Dominic, but I think one of my struggles is that we are, I think you mentioned in the question around Christendom and the Christendom mentality, and I think culturally as well, we're still thinking about how do we do what we do, and that's in one sense that's fine, and that's part of that. So we're thinking about how do we use technology, how do we use this, how do we use that to do what we do, and I think that understandably we've rushed to that. I think the longer this goes on, the more I'm reflecting that we need somehow to stop doing on that, because the world around us is going through massive change and we don't yet know what it's going to be like. And we are busy looking for answers when we don't yet know what the question is. And that's what I'm finding really frustrating. And there's a big, I was doing one of these the other day. I was doing some worship, and the Psalm 130, we wait for the morning, like what is it? We wait like the watchman for the morning, whatever, I've forgotten the thing. And that we need to stop and actually look and listen and be present in a way which is not about solving problems, but is about simple listening.
Yeah, I mean that in that Psalm, Mark, as well, the thing that always strikes me is we look for the morning like the night watch looks for the morning. Yeah. And it's so important that it's repeated twice.
Yeah,
that we repeat it, and just in case we missed it. And the night watch doesn't narrate or put up Facebook posts at every moment, at every change of the light. They just stop and wait for the big news, because otherwise people just cloud it out. Because if you're just always talking, it's like notice boards. If you're designing a notice board, you want as less stuff as possible, so that because the clutter just blocks everything and you don't hear anything. So there's something about that. I think it's interesting about grief, and because I've had quite a lot of significant death within the congregation here, and quite public deaths, and therefore people being forced into public grief before they're ready. Obviously, my own grief of the loss of my wife was understandably public because of her popularity. She was very, very extroverted, very connected, and all that stuff. So we went through death very publicly, and obviously as an ordained minister, I'm a public figure, so everyone looked to me at how I would respond. And from then on, I've had to admit that I am grieving. And one of the things that God taught me at that time, and has repeated, and I have walked with others through public grief, is this sense of how painful the disorientation is. and how it's not the nice words or the articulation of grief, which is profound. All of that becomes unnecessary noise, that all you want to do is go to sleep, and all you want to do is cry and cry and cry until you collapse in exhaustion. And every request for "Are you okay?", every kind word becomes a burden. And I think the church needs to understand that we will grieve because the world is grieving. And what Penny said again really touched me about, let's stop worrying about ourselves. God's got us. He's holding us, and he's telling us, just quiet now, just still, cry until you fall asleep. Because there's a world crying, and we need to tap into that, and to be able to just publicly say and stand up and sort of in response to Simon's phrase about how we talk about death. I don't think I've talked about death, but I have modeled grief and just modeled the silence of, that presence. Funerals have been devastating, but I've just stood there and wept with families, and that's enough. Just to say, this person knows this person experiences it, because that's what God does with us in grief. He doesn't say lots of stuff. In fact, he is surprisingly and painfully silent in grief. But my experience of God is that he stands out of sight, protecting and guarding. And we as a church, if we're going to do anything, need to do that.
Thanks, Ned. So what I want to do now is just to come to an end. I want to invite everybody just to share a couple, just a couple of minutes each, just saying what are they taking, what are you taking away from this conversation around this call to what the church has got to face in terms of this pandemic, coming from our vocation of being involved in new monastic communities. So I'm going to call people out, and then I'll invite you. So Rachel, if you'd like to go first.
I think there was a lot that I really learnt from this conversation, and I think just really moved by what Ned's just said, and something that's just that I really need to think on more, especially around grief and around death. I think a few people have mentioned that, and being in Australia, I guess things are quite different here. We've been in isolation, and we're sort of coming out slowly from that, and things are changing, but we haven't had the same devastation as the UK and a lot of European countries and America, and to be able to, as Ned said, grieve with those who are grieving, and offer support in some way to those people that are really, really struggling. And I think, finding those in the community that I guess it's a position of privilege to talk about, what are the positives that are coming out of this? That's, and there are some things that the church are learning, and things that I guess some blessings that have come in some way from it, but that is a real position of privilege, that there is real devastation and pain and hurt and suffering and in the world right now, and to be able to hold those things together, I think is really important.
Thanks, Rachel. Simon Lewis.
Yeah, I think it was really helpful to hear other people's reflections, and I think it returns me to I think what I've seen here, which is a sense that we need more simplicity. That's the only way that we can navigate through the plethora of opportunities that do exist. That we need to return to be more hopeful, but that we also, like many have said, we need to be willing to give quite a lot up along the way for that to happen. So that feels like the call for this time.
Thanks, Simon. Penny.
I would echo that. I was very challenged by the words that some of you used about consumerism and idols. And actually, idols are often things that are really, really useful. And the practice of letting go. And from my own experience, the daily practice of hanging about with God and wasting time and sometimes not wanting to go to prayer because I've got better things to do. But, you know, still doing it, that practice of letting go actually fits very powerfully to me with the whole thing of dying, and where Paul talks about, you know, let death be at work in you so that life may be at work in others. So that daily dying, the simplicity, and I think, you know, that's echoed in all of us. That's so important. And simplicity then can mean actually having time for the people that are around us and to cherish them. Compassion is to feel with them. If we don't know them, we won't feel with them. But like Ned is saying, you know, when your neighbour cries because you know them, you jolly well cry too. And, you know, it's just so simple, and yet we make it all so complicated by making everything so big. And if the church has to combine parishes, and my heart sinks, it really, really does. But as church leaders, then we have to find ways of countering that, or stepping out of it, rather than just being pushed along into something that we just don't believe in anymore. We've got to be courageous and actually practice the letting go, big time.
Yeah. Thanks, Penny. Pete.
Yeah. You know, obviously, those of you who are ordained, that, you know, this is cold-face stuff for you guys, and, you know, I don't envy you some of the challenges that you've got at the moment, because, you know, you think about all the issues of combining of parishes, and, you know, many of them are too big already, and you know, it's just a recipe for burnout for people. So yeah, we do need a new model, and I don't know what the answer to that is. Yeah, I think for me, you know, a lot of what we've talked about is just coming back to the simplicity of why we're doing all this stuff. You know, as Penny shared when she first spoke, you know, about the monos, about, you know, we're doing this because we want to be available to God. Yeah, we've a lot of us have shared about the simplicity of that. You know, the seeming uselessness sometimes of prayer, the waste of time phrase, you know, all those kind of things, that actually that is core to who we are. And perhaps if we can't model that, we can model nothing. So, you know, for me, it's that thing, it's the call to the core of why we value this movement, and to make sure that we're continuing to put that at the centre, and to live whatever our answers are out of that place of prayer.
Thanks, Pete. Simon, Cartwright.
Thank you. I think what struck me is the importance of listening, the importance to spend time in this period of just listening to the pain of the world. We've heard a lot about the pain of the world and the angst of the world, the frustration of the world that they're not getting what they want, and that sense of angst and frustration that's coming out in petty small-mindedness. Listening to the voices of the excluded. I've been privileged to be involved heavily in the mutual aid support and food distribution support. There's a lot of people who are hungry, a lot of people who are marginalised, touched by Ian's reflections from his estate. We need to listen to the excluded. Touched too by the importance of those we're called to walk alongside at this moment of time. I speak to my spiritual director, who's a leader of a religious community, a traditional religious community. You know, we don't always want to walk alongside the people we're called to walk alongside at this moment, but we are called to walk alongside them. And they're the people I'm spending a lot of time with, a lot of time praying with, and their own pain, but they're also their joy of, we are in this community. That's part of what new monasticism is about, is the forced community. And finally, the listening for the still small voice. It's the classic passage from Elijah, but I'm struck by the NRSV version of that, where it says, "We listen to the sound of sheer silence." That so often when we're called ourselves into a place of listening and quietness, we're looking for a small voice to tell us what to do, but actually what we're listening for is silence. And sometimes we just need to be quiet. And I'm struck by what Penny had to say.
Thanks, Simon. Mark?
I think to some extent, my sister Penny said it better than I could possibly say it. And I just in one sense want to just affirm everything that she just said. But then the word came to me, and the word was vigil and vigilant. And just a sense of thinking about the watchman and the praying and the place of, is our place as church to be in a place of vigil. And I just quickly sort of did a little on my phone, just put the word vigil, and it came up with vigilant, and it came up with the definition, careful watching. And I just thought, okay, how do we watch carefully? And it was just maybe, I don't know, that just felt like it was just a word of vigil and vigilant that just came to me as we were speaking.
Thanks, Mark. Ned?
Yeah, thanks, Mark, for that. That's really helpful. Two things. One about, the importance, particularly for us in the Society of the Holy Trinity, of contextual, that the need to trust the people in the context. And I would balk at sort of centralized, one-size-fits-all responses to change, that it needs to be contextual and therefore present in the community. So Ian's description is beautiful, and I trust that he knows how to serve in that. But although it's got similarities to mine, it's different, and so we will respond differently to those contexts. And I think it's important to remind ourselves of that God calls us to different contexts. And for me personally, in terms of what I'm excited about, and I want to, because I've been talking a lot about grief and despair, finish on a hope. I am continually excited about what the Augustinian canon regulars offered the church when they did, and when it renewed in the 12th century, and indeed when it renewed in the Catholic Church at 17th, 18th century as well. That these are times of great change, and here were lay and clergy living together, sharing property, doing acts of the apostles sort of stuff, of being of one heart and mind at the heart of their Augustinian rule. And that excites me as a clergy person, of going, that would sustain me. If I had that, if I had a community who were dedicated to serving alongside me as equals, and sometimes as more, that would excite me. I just don't know what it looks like in the Church of England or the Anglican Church at the moment. And I am deeply praying about that. And this conversation has encouraged me to continue to discern that for myself, and maybe for wider as well.
Thanks, Ned. Wow, big conversation. Just a few things from me. I've been touched. There's a whole thought going through my head that I'll just try to speak into, which are new to me. I'm feeling a little bit humbled. So yesterday, I was wearing my mask, gloves, everything, looking like something from outer space, trying to get to the supermarket, and came across some black youths who refused to get out of the way. And we had a slight altercation as I tried to get past, trying to maintain social distancing. And then I went into privilege mode. I think, God, Ian, what are you doing? So actually their anger was because they had unprocessed grief. Their anger yesterday wasn't about me. It was about the fact that they had no idea how to deal with what is going on. So this conversation is really helpful to me, that actually what we're seeing is responses to fear, actually, I think. And the fear is being processed in two different ways. In the world, as I think many of you said, there's issues about the fact, how do we help people process grief? And there's many people who do not know how to process grief, and that's why we're seeing the rise in mental illness, addictions, domestic violence. So how do we then help the world to process grief. Because that fear is fundamentally about the fact that we live in a culture which is now very difficult to trust anything and anybody. So some of that fear and grief comes from that deep sense of we can trust nobody anymore in a market society. I think it's deep within a market society is that sense of no ability to trust anymore. And the church, I'm worried that I'm just seeing patterns of response to that fear, not towards anger, but maybe patterns of ridiculous overworking, of addiction, over-reliant on let's just do what we do more. So there's a sense of needing to process fear. You know, I think lots of churches are now struggling to trust God in a pandemic. I think church leaders are struggling to trust God in a pandemic. And therefore, ultimately, we've got to go back to prayer, because the only real way of building up a trusting relationship with God, I think, is through a loving encounter with God in silence and through all the other different ways of praying. So yeah, so I think those are the two things I'm struck by, is that we got to expect the world to be angry and disorientated because it doesn't know how to process this grief. And the church, please, can we not just go into more consumptive church's business and for patterns of addiction, which is what I think we do in these situations. Anyway, those are just my thoughts. So my big thanks to everybody today. So this will be the second recording. There will be another in a couple of weeks' time, which will be thinking about what this says, what New Monastic Community has to say to those who are outside of church and formal religion, in terms of what this says about God in the world. So my thanks today to Penny, to Ned, to Rachel, to Mark, to Pete, to Simon and Simon. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you.
Thank you.